You may be seated. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
It's Friday. The sun is shining. The Hawkeyes won. Life is good. We are ready to proceed with the state's case. Further evidence or testimony on behalf of the state, Mr. Bull.
Yes, Your Honor. State offers Exhibit 34 at this time.
Your Honor, I maintain the objection previously stated.
All right, and I'm not sure I've had a chance to review that exhibit. Do you plan to publish any of it, Mr. Bull?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Exhibit 34 is admitted subject to the objection. Further evidence, Mr. Bull.
Your Honor, the state calls Brett Haupert.
Sir, if I can get you to raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated. I'm going to ask you to sit up close to that microphone. Try to speak right into the microphone. If you would start by stating your full name for the record. Spell your last name, please.
Brett Haupert, Haupert.
Mr. Bull.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a lieutenant with the Pella Police Department.
Sir, before we go any further, do you have any knowledge about the death or investigation of Shirley Carter?
Nothing more than the average person would.
Can you tell this jury your educational and professional background?
Yes. I hold an associate's degree from Iowa Central Community College in criminology. I hold a bachelor's degree in law enforcement with a minor in corrections from Minnesota State University. And I am a graduate of the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy. And since graduating from the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy, I have 1,345 hours of ongoing training. 340 of those hours are narcotics investigations.
What police department do you work for?
The Pella Police Department.
And were you employed by the Pella Police Department on June 19th of 2015?
Yes, I was.
In what capacity?
I was assigned to the Mid-Iowa Narcotics Enforcement Drug Task Force.
What is the Mid-Iowa Drug Enforcement Task Force?
The Mid-Iowa Narcotics Enforcement Drug Task Force is a multi-jurisdictional agency designed to combat narcotics at the user, street-level dealer, all the way up to the high-level narcotics trafficking organizations.
You use the term multi-jurisdictional. What does that mean?
It means it's multiple agencies that join together to help combat the fight against drugs.
In June of 2015, did that include all areas of Marion County, Iowa?
Yes, it did.
Can you explain to the jury, as a member of that task force, what does that mean you did?
We investigated drugs.
What type of drugs?
The main three in the area at the time were methamphetamine, marijuana, and prescription pills. Heroin was making an emergence into the area, but not as much as the other three.
Sir, now you mentioned prescription pills. How do they come into play in drug enforcement and policing?
Prescription pills are traded and abused just like any illicit drug.
Sir, based on your education, training, experience, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of law enforcement certainty as to which types of drugs were sought-after drugs in the prescription world in June of 2015 by criminals?
Yes, I do.
What were they?
Mostly opioids.
And what are commonly known opioids?
Oxycontin, hydrocodone, fentanyl, things of that nature.
Are you familiar with the drug diazepam?
Yes, I am.
What is how else would we know the name diazepam? What is its retail or brand name?
Valium.
In addition, sir, as a drug task force officer, was the only thing you did investigate drug violations?
No, it wasn't.
What else did you do?
In narcotics, we saw a lot of crossover crimes. And what crossover crimes are, for example, like thefts and burglaries. And the reason we saw a lot of those is because the addicts and abusers would need money to obtain their drugs that they wanted. So they had to go out and steal things if they didn't have the means to do that.
Thank you, sir. State of Iowa passes the witness.
Cross-examination.
No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You may step down. May this witness be excused.
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
You are excused. Thank you. Further evidence on behalf of the state.
Yes, Your Honor. The state would call Anna Young.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I can get you to raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I'm going to ask that you sit up, speak right into that microphone, and start by stating your full name and spelling your last name, please.
My name is Anna Elizabeth Young. My last name is spelled Y-O-U-N-G.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Your Honor. How are you currently employed?
I am employed as a criminalist at the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, Criminalistics Laboratory in Ankeny, Iowa.
And what section of the lab do you work in?
I'm assigned to the impression evidence section, which means latent prints, footwear, and tire impressions.
Can you explain what a criminalist in the impression evidence section does?
Sure. In my particular case, because I'm assigned to the impression evidence section, I look at evidence that's either submitted from outside agencies or lifts that are submitted from agencies. We process evidence and we examine those for latent prints as well as footwear and tire impressions.
How long have you been a criminalist at the DCI crime lab?
Since November of 2010.
And were you employed prior to that?
I was employed by the Des Moines Police Department Crime Scene Unit for approximately 5 years.
Can you tell us your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in anthropology from Iowa State University. I also have a master's degree in forensic science from Nebraska Wesleyan University.
In addition to that, have you received any specialized training or education specifically related to your employment?
I have. I've attended numerous crime scene courses as well as latent print courses. Through my employment with the DCI, I completed a 2-year structured training program in latent prints and impression evidence. At the end of that, I sat for the latent print certification test through the International Association for Identification, and I'm a certified latent print examiner.
Now, before we get into the specifics of this case, I want to spend a little time dealing with just general information about impression evidence, okay? Can you explain to the jury what friction ridged skin is?
Friction ridged skin is the ridged skin that's found on your fingers, the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and your toes.
And what is a latent print?
A latent print is the chance reproduction of the friction ridged skin on the surface of an object, usually in sweat.
And what is a known print?
A known print is the reproduction of the friction ridged skin taken under controlled conditions.
Now, if someone touches an object, will they necessarily leave a latent print?
Not necessarily. There are a lot of variables that can go into whether or not a latent print is deposited and whether or not that print would be what we consider suitable. Some of those variables could mean if you put your hand on something and you slide it, those ridges are going to slide, and so the characteristics might be gone. Latent prints are mostly water, so if it's too hot, that water evaporates. If it's too cold, it can freeze. Sometimes people wear gloves in the wintertime. Body chemistry can play a role in it. My hands tend to be very dry, so if I touch an object, I may not leave an identifiable fingerprint.
How do you develop a latent print?
It's dependent on the surface. There are some different techniques we can use. Generally, if a surface is what we consider to be non-porous, which would be something like metal or glass, something slick, we'll use what's commonly referred to as a superglue method. You may have seen it on TV, where we heat up some water, create some humidity, heat up some superglue, create a vapor, and then the vapor comes down and it adheres to the moisture in the prints. And then we use a chemical dye stain to make it fluoresce, which clears up some of the details for us. If it's a non-porous item, we'll use a different chemical process that will work with the non-water portion of the prints. So a non-porous item would be something like paper or cardboard, something to that effect. And we can apply chemicals to that to either make that fluoresce, or we can apply it to make it appear a purple color.
And can you explain how fingerprints are compared?
What we're looking for when we're examining fingerprints is what we consider to be identifiable characteristics. And when I'm referring to fingerprints, that is three groups. It's dots, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a dot. A bifurcation, which is when one ridge comes up and splits into two, or an ending ridge, which is when one ridge comes up and stops. We're looking for those individual characteristics in relationship to each other and relationship to the print overall.
Now, did you conduct latent print or impression evidence examinations in the investigation of Shirley Carter's death?
I did.
And did you generate reports of your examinations?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness? I am handing you what's been marked for identification purposes as exhibits 29, 30, and 31. Can you take a look at those, please? And what are those items?
These are the reports I authored in regards to this case.
And are those true and accurate copies of your reports?
They are.
State would offer exhibits 29, 30, and 31.
No objection.
Exhibits 29, 30, and 31 are admitted.
In this case, were you provided with latent prints that had been developed at the crime scene?
I was.
And where were those latent prints developed?
The locations of them?
Yes.
Would it be okay if I referred to my notes, Your Honor?
Any objection?
No objection.
You may.
I was provided 11 developed latent lifts from the crime scene, and they all appeared to be from the entry door area.
And were pieces of physical evidence also submitted for you to examine?
They were.
And did you attempt to develop latent prints on those items?
Yes, I did.
Were you successful in developing latent prints on all of those items?
No, not all of the items.
How many items were you able to develop prints on?
11.
And what items were those?
Those were 6 greeting cards, 2 items that had miscellaneous papers in them, a gun safe, and some paper receipt forms.
Were you also provided known prints in this case?
Yes, I was.
And who were you provided known prints for?
I was provided known prints for Shirley Carter, Jason Jean Carter, Chase Carter, Shelley Carter, Bill Carter, and I also did comparisons with a couple other people as well. But I wasn't provided known prints that were submitted for those.
Now, did you compare the latent prints you were able to develop against those known prints?
Yes, I did.
And let's kind of walk through those comparisons if we can. With respect to the developed prints that were submitted to you, were any of those prints identified as coming from the individuals we just discussed?
One was identified as Chase Carter.
So how many of the prints on the back door were unidentified?
In item 8,
Yes.
one remained unidentified.
Now, on the, for lack of a better term, the first greeting card that you developed latent prints on, I believe it's item 17. How many prints of value were developed on that item?
There was one.
And was that print identified as belonging to the known individuals?
No.
With respect to the next greeting card, which I believe was item 24, how many prints of value were developed on that item?
7.
And were any of those prints identified as coming from the known submitted individuals?
They were all Chase Carter.
And with respect to the next greeting card, which was, I believe, item number 27, how many prints of value were developed on that item?
There were 8 developed on that item.
And were any of those prints identified as belonging to the known prints?
All 8 were Chase Carter.
And with respect to the next card, which I believe is item 35, were there any prints of value developed on that card?
There was one.
And did that belong to any of the known individuals?
It did not.
On item 39, the next greeting card, how many prints of value were developed?
There were 2.
And did either of those prints belong to the known individuals?
They did not.
With respect to item 40, which is, I believe, another greeting card, how many prints of value were developed?
There were 3.
And were any of those prints identified as belonging to the known individuals?
They were not.
With respect to item 55, which I believe was paper from the desk area, how many prints of value were developed?
3.
Were any of those identified as belonging to the known individuals?
No.
On item 56, how many?
I'm sorry, item,
56.
thank you.
How many prints of value were developed?
1.
Did that print belong to any of the known individuals?
No.
With respect to item 83, how many prints of value were developed?
There were 55.
And did any of those prints belong to the known individuals?
31 were Jason Carter, 20 were Chase Carter, and 3 were Shelley Carter.
Were there any unknown prints?
There was one unknown print, yes.
And what was item 83?
It was a metal gun safe.
With respect to item, I believe it was 104, how many prints of value were developed?
There were 25.
Did any of those prints belong to the known individuals?
22 of them were Jason Carter.
And what was item 104?
It was paper receipt forms.
Now I want to step back for just a second to item 83. Can you explain to the jury where those fingerprints were developed? And just to clarify, item 83 is the gun safe, correct?
It is. They were found on the interior front door, the interior back, the latch locking mechanism on the inside. The gun safe had a small shelf in the upper portion of it. Prints were developed on the top and the underside of that. The interior left side and the interior right side and the exterior left side.
Whose print was located on the exterior left side?
There were 3 prints that were identified to Shirley Carter.
Were the unknown prints that you developed on those items searched through any databases to attempt to identify the source?
They were. Any unidentified prints were searched through the FBI's database, which is comprised of both civilian and criminal files.
Were you able to identify any of the unknown latent prints by running it through the FBI database?
No.
Were the unknown prints added to an unsolved latent database?
They were.
If there is a reverse hit on those prints, would you be notified?
I would be, yes.
And can you explain to the jury what a reverse hit is?
When a latent print goes into the reverse or into the unknown latent file, it is then compared with any additional prints that are submitted to the database. It's searched against them. And if the algorithm's threshold is high enough, it will do what's called a reverse hit, and that will comprise an individual that then an examiner has to compare to decide if it actually is a hit or not.
Have you received any such notifications in this case?
No.
Okay. Now let me just back up to clarify a couple of things. Would it be unusual for you to not find Shirley Carter's fingerprints on the items you examined?
Not necessarily, because of the variables we talked about previously.
Based on your experience, would it be unusual to find a grandson's prints in his grandparents' house?
No.
And based on your experience, would it be unusual to find unknown prints on greeting cards?
No.
I want to back up for a second to item 104. Can you explain again what that item was?
Are you asking me to explain exactly what it says on the receipt forms?
No. Are you aware of what that paperwork was?
Yes.
What was it?
It's a copy of a search warrant and the DCI receipt forms that are given to someone when property is seized.
No further questions, thank you.
Cross-examination.
Ms. Young, you also took Jason Carter's prints when he came into the station to give you additional known prints, is that correct?
Yes, I met him at post 1 to collect his known prints.
Was he cooperative and calm during that time?
Yes.
Now, let me just make sure that we go over it. There was an unidentified print on the back door,
Yes.
an unidentified print on the gun safe,
Yes.
and unidentified prints on many of the greeting cards.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned Chase Carter's prints on the gun safe. Was there something unusual about Chase Carter's prints on that gun safe?
They appeared slightly smaller than his known prints when I compared them.
Might that indicate that those prints were left when he was younger and smaller?
It could.
And when you talked about a print on the locking mechanism, that was Jason Carter's print, correct?
It was.
And it was actually behind the lock, so it was between the metal and the locking mechanism, correct?
We're talking about two different prints, I think.
Okay, so there was one print that was actually behind the lock, is that correct?
Yes, can I explain how the gun safe locks?
Yes.
The way the gun safe locks is it has a mechanism that turns and then two metal rods go up and down at the same time to lock the door in place. To process this gun safe, I disassembled it. So there was a print it's 83K, I think is the one you're talking about. It's behind the locking mechanism, and it would have been difficult to leave that print, I think, if the safe had been assembled.
So there are prints on the bottom of the shelf,
Yes.
behind the locking mechanism,
Yes, there was one behind it.
and on the sides. Those prints would be consistent with assembling the safe, wouldn't they?
They could be.
And there weren't any prints on the front of the safe for any of Jason Carter's prints.
Are you referring to the front door?
Yes.
The exterior front door? No, I didn't have any identifiable prints on the front door. The exterior side.
Do you know how many total unidentifiable prints were found in this case?
Total unidentified prints?
Yes.
Out of the 111 identifiable prints in this case, I identified 91 of them. So 20.
I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor. Where was the unidentified print located on the gun safe?
It was on the interior top of the door.
Would it be unusual to find a print on an item? Let me rephrase that question. Based on your experience, is it unusual for you to find unidentified prints on items from a crime scene?
It depends on the item, and it depends on how many people may have had access to those items.
What do you mean?
Well, take the greeting cards, for instance. You don't know how many people thumbed through those at the store. You don't know how many people passed them around at a table to look at them. So it's not unusual to find prints that you can't identify, but I'm not sure why they would be on particular items.
What about unidentified prints on a front door to a house?
I guess it depends on how many people you have coming to your house and touching your front door.
Would you expect based on your experience, would it be unreasonable to expect to develop a print from someone in the manufacturing process of an item?
It could, if a latent print is deposited and the environment remains unchanged, meaning it's protected from, let's say, the elements, dust, it hasn't been cleaned for a while, they can remain for long periods of time.
No further questions.
Anything further, Ms. Branstad?
No, Your Honor. Oh, one moment, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you, ma'am. You may step down. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Branstad,
Yes, Your Honor.
you are excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Further evidence on behalf of the state.
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Victor Murillo.
Right up there, sir. I can get you to raise your right hand for me, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated. Going to ask that you sit right up to that microphone, try to speak right into it, and if you would please state your full name, spell your last name.
My name is Victor Michael Murillo. Last name is spelled Murillo.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what do you do for a living?
So I'm employed as a criminalist with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations State Crime Laboratory in Ankeny, Iowa.
And what section of the crime lab are you assigned to?
So currently I'm assigned to the Firearms and Tool Mark section of our lab.
And what does a criminalist in the Firearms and Tool Mark section do?
So my job basically entails the examination of firearms-related evidence. So we look at a number of different types of guns. We need to make sure those firearms are functional, that the safeties are working. Eventually, a lot of those guns are test-fired and used for comparison to unknowns. So we look at a lot of fired components, fired bullets, fired cartridge cases, try to match those to one another, and possibly match those to a specific firearm if there is one that is submitted in that case.
How long have you been with the DCI Crime Lab?
So I've been with the laboratory since 1982, full-time in the firearms section since 1989.
Do you have any experience before the DCI Crime Lab?
No.
Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
So I have an Associate of Arts degree in Criminalistics from the Des Moines Area Community College in Ankeny, where I took several forensic classes that are kind of related to the different sections of the lab that I currently work in. I also have a bachelor's degree from Drake University, where I took a lot of science classes, so a lot of chemistry and biology classes that could be used for the job that I currently am employed in.
And have you received any additional training specifically related to your current role with the DCI Crime Lab?
Yes, so all of the criminalists, when they come to the laboratory, some of them are going to have experience, some of them not, but we all will receive some type of training once we're assigned to a specific section. So I work with other criminalists in the laboratory and received a lot of training from them. We receive a lot of training from outside agencies. I've been to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, about 6 or 7 different times, taking classes from them, usually 1 or 2 week classes. We receive a lot of training from ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It's another federal agency that provides a lot of training to individuals like myself. So a lot of training from federal agencies, from other state agencies, and most of the training within our own Department of Public Safety in the crime laboratory, looking at a lot of items that are going to be similar to what we'll look at in an actual case when our training is complete.
Now, before we get into the specifics of your investigation of this case, I just want to discuss a few basic ideas so we're all on the same page. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Handing you what has been, I believe, admitted as State's Exhibit 155.
It is in evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you take a look at that?
All right, open it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know what that item is, sir?
Well, this item, Exhibit 155, is I believe, a live round of ammunition that was submitted in this case, and I did look at that item. It has my initials on it, so I know I've looked at this previously.
Okay. And we'll get into its role in the investigation, but what I want you to do is kind of use it to help explain what we're going to discuss with the jury.
Sure.
Can you explain to the jury what a bullet is?
Yeah, so what I did have in front of me when I originally looked at this item was a live round. It's a cartridge, as we call it. That cartridge is made up of several components. The bullet that you're referring to is also inside of this little box, but the bullet is the projectile that would be at the front end of that cartridge. That is the part of that cartridge that's going to be fired and is pushed down the barrel and towards the target that we're aiming at, or that we're trying to hit with that particular firearm and ammunition combination.
And can you describe the composition of a bullet?
So bullets are made of a number of different materials. This one just happens to be a copper-jacketed bullet that has a lead core. So it starts out as a tiny little cup. Yeah, it's made to a specific dimension. And then, as you can see on the top of that bullet, you can see some gray material, and that's a very soft piece of lead that's introduced inside of that cup, and then they're all formed together to make the final product, that bullet. Some bullets are made of just lead, some are brass, some, in this particular case, we're looking at a copper-jacketed bullet with a lead core.
Now, can bullets come in different sizes?
Yeah, so this particular bullet came from a .270 Winchester cartridge. That particular bullet has a diameter of about 277 thousandths of an inch, .277. So bullets come in different widths, so that diameter will change depending on the bullet that comes out of that particular cartridge. And the length will be different as well to give it more or less weight. So yes, they're all made differently, different sizes, different weights, depending on the cartridge that they're going to be used in.
And what is a cartridge?
So a cartridge is what we were just talking about. It's the entire round of ammunition. That cartridge is made up of basically 4 different components. One is the cartridge case, which is what I have to the right here, to your left. So that cartridge case is kind of like the cup that's used to hold all of the other components. At the bottom of that cartridge case, there is a primer. There's a little round piece of metal that's inserted into the head of the cartridge, and that kind of acts like a spark plug that's hit by the firing pin of the gun that it's being fired in. When you pull the trigger, there's a firing pin or a striker that goes forward, it hits that primer, and it causes a spark on the inside of that cartridge case. That spark is going to ignite the powder, which we have in this little vial. The smokeless powder that's inside of that cartridge is going to be ignited. It burns. It creates a lot of pressure inside of that cartridge when it's in the chamber, when it's in the gun. And that pressure is what pushes the bullet out of the mouth or the top end of the cartridge down the barrel towards the target that we're aiming at. So that cartridge is made up of those 4 components: the cartridge case, the primer, the powder, and the bullet or the projectile.
What happens to the cartridge casing after the bullet is fired?
Well, it depends on the firearm. Sometimes the cartridge case may stay in that gun when it's fired and has to be manually ejected or removed from the firearm. If it's a semi-automatic type of firearm, then that cartridge case, from all of the pressure that builds up, may be extracted and ejected automatically when that gun is fired. So sometimes it's left in the gun after being fired, sometimes it's ejected close to where that weapon was discharged.
Okay. I want to back up for just a second. You described this round or this cartridge as a .270 Winchester, is that correct?
Correct.
What does the .270 refer to?
Well, it kind of refers to the diameter of the bullet. I talked earlier about this particular bullet is actually .277 diameter, specific diameter or the width of the bullet. That particular bullet is used in this cartridge. So the .270 Winchester cartridge is just the name of a cartridge that was developed when this cartridge was initially developed by the manufacturer. Even though it doesn't really have a .270 bullet, it's just a name that's given to that particular cartridge.
Okay. And when we say Winchester, are we referring to the cartridge casing?
So the 270 Winchester refers to the name of the cartridge. So if this was an entire round of ammunition, that's what we would call that particular cartridge. The 270 kind of refers to the diameter of the bullet. It's kind of close. Winchester means that Winchester is a ammunition manufacturer, and they were instrumental in helping to develop this particular cartridge a long time ago. So they put their name as part of that cartridge.
Now, is one of your roles in the firearms and tool mark section to, and I think you discussed this, but to compare bullets?
Yeah, and I kind of talked about that earlier. That's one of the things that we can do is if we have multiple bullets that are submitted in a case, we can take a lot of information from those items, compare them to one another, and try and determine whether they were all fired from the same firearm or not.
Can you give us just an idea of how you go about comparing bullets?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of notes, again, that are taken on each bullet or bullet fragment that we look at. We're going to look at the composition of that item, what it's made of, look at the diameter. We also look at rifling information that's present on that bullet. That rifling information comes from the outside of the bullet making contact with the inside of the barrel of the gun that it's fired from. So all of those things, the rifling information, the diameter of the bullet, the weight of the bullet, are all taken into consideration when we're doing comparisons between multiple bullets, trying to determine if they all have the same, what we call class characteristics. If they do, then we can go sometimes a little further and look at them microscopically and try to make that determination whether they were or were not fired from the same firearm.
Now, did you conduct firearm and tool marks examinations in this investigation?
Yes, I did.
And did you generate reports of your examinations?
There were multiple reports actually on this case, but yeah, the initial report in regards to some bullet fragments was eventually written, and it was sent out to the submitting agency in this case.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Handing you what's been marked as exhibits, marked for identification purposes, exhibits 26, 27, and 28. Can you take a look at those?
Yes.
What are those, sir?
So these three items, 26, 27, and 28, are three reports that I generated in this particular case.
And do those truly and accurately reflect your reports?
Yes, they're exact copies of my reports. They're all signed, and I do recognize them as being part of this case.
State offers exhibits 26, 27, and 28, Your Honor.
No objection.
Exhibits 26, 27, and 28 are all admitted.
Were you provided bullet fragments in this case from the crime scene?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I retrieve exhibits and provide them to the witness?
You may.
Giving you exhibits 147, 48, and 149. And just take a look at those quick.
Okay.
Are those the fragments you received from the crime scene, sir?
They appear to be, yes, the same ones that I looked at.
And were you also provided bullet fragments from the state medical examiner's office in this case?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Handing you what I believe has already been admitted as exhibits 150, 151, and 152.
Okay.
Are those the items you received from the state medical examiner's office?
Yes, I believe so.
Your Honor, may I publish those exhibits for the jury?
You may.
The last.
Yeah, the last three.
For the record, this is exhibit 151. You just,
You might want to zoom that in, counsel.
yes, Your Honor. What are we looking at here?
So that's one of the three that came from the victim in this particular case. And so those are some small lead and copper fragments that were collected and submitted.
And look at exhibit 152. About this one.
Again, another small copper lead fragment that was submitted from the body.
Okay. And then exhibit 150. Can you tell the jury what that is?
So this is a larger copper jacket fragment. This is one that I believe was recovered from the left shoulder of the victim in this case.
Did you receive any other potential bullet fragments in this case?
I believe there was another small fragment that was submitted at a later time that I also looked at, but that was, those were the items that were submitted initially from the scene and from the body.
Your Honor, may I publish exhibit 146?
You may.
Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Kind of. It is pretty small. I think it is another small lead fragment that was recovered at a later time and was also submitted. So I did look at it. It appeared to be lead. I weighed it, just like all the other items. Took some notes on that item as well.
Based on your examinations of the bullet fragments in this case, were you able to determine the possible size of the bullets?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do is to look at the diameter of these bullet fragments, or some of them. And so when I measured the width of the bullet fragments, or at least some of them, I determined that they were about approximately 280 to 290 in diameter. So there's a number of cartridges that use that particular type of bullet, so I could come up with some cartridges that those bullet fragments could have come from.
Now, when you're looking at the diameter of the bullet fragments, would that diameter have been affected by striking objects?
Yes, and we talked earlier about the 270 bullet, for instance. It's the original diameter of that bullet is 277. We talked about that earlier. So when that bullet is fired, it's going to be the same diameter. When it impacts a target of some sort, depending on the target material, it is going to become distorted. It will fragment, as you can see from what we've looked at, and it will possibly be a different size and shape than the original bullet that was loaded in that particular cartridge. So the answer, yes, it will be different.
So, could the bullets that you examined have come from a 270 Winchester?
Yes, so in my report, like I said, I have to give a number of different cartridges that those bullets could have come from, and the 270 Winchester is certainly one possibility.
Now, shifting gears just a little bit, were you able to come to a conclusion as to how many rounds or cartridges were fired in this case?
Yeah, so by looking at all of the bullet fragments, I determined that they were the result of 2 bullets that were fired.
And how did you determine that there was 2 bullets?
Well, one of the things that we do is we look at the physical characteristics of some of those fragments. There were 2 separate bases of those bullets that were visible when I looked at those larger fragments, actually the ones that we didn't put underneath the Elmo, but the ones I have in front of me, one that came from a refrigerator, one that came from a floor. Those both had the bases or the back ends of the bullet intact. So I could see that, that's how I measured the diameter of those bullet fragments. There were only 2 bases present in all of the fragments. And also what I do is look at the total weight that's present of all of those. Bullets are going to weigh a specific amount. And so we can take all of those fragments, weigh them, and try and figure out how many bullets we have by the total weight that's determined.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness? What's been marked as Exhibit 122 and 123. We'll take a look at those items.
Yes,
Do you recognize those photographs?
yes, I do.
What are they photographs of?
These are actually 2 photographs that I took of the fragments that we were just talking about, and it kind of shows the 2 bases that I was just talking about on 2 of the fragments, one from the fridge and one from the floor next to the victim.
Do they truly and accurately reflect those bullet fragments?
Yes.
State moves to admit 121 and, 122 and 123.
No objection.
Exhibits 122 and 123 are admitted.
Now, you also mentioned the weight of the bullets. What would you have expected the weight of the bullets to be in this case?
So for instance, the bullet that we looked at in that original cartridge is about 150 grains is what we use to weigh, that's the unit of measurement that we use to weigh bullets. So that original bullet weight in this cartridge is 150 grains. Depending on the cartridge, there are a lot of different weights of bullets that are used, even in a .270 Winchester cartridge, and it could be anywhere from about 130 to 150 grains is what that original bullet weight should be. So if I had a bullet that was totally intact, it was all there, it should weigh that amount, between 130 and 150 grains. Obviously, that's not the case because we have fragmentation. So by looking at the fragments, I knew I didn't have the total weight present on those fragments.
Did you weigh the fragments you were provided?
Yes, I did.
And what was the total weight of the fragments you were provided?
So there was one of the bullets that I mentioned came from the floor that was next to the victim. That one weighed approximately 96, 97 grains. So it's about maybe 60% of the original weight of that bullet. The other bullet fragments, or at least the larger pieces, from both the refrigerator and the one that we looked at from the left shoulder of the victim, those appeared to be, from what I looked at, appeared to be from the same bullet and weighed about the same. They were approximately 88, almost 90 grains, if I remember correctly. One of them was about 66 grains, the other one about 21 grains, the one that was in the shoulder. So adding those two together, about the same weight. It's a little less than 100 grains for that particular bullet. The other smaller fragments that we looked at, the tiny little pieces of lead, were virtually, I almost couldn't weigh them. There was almost nothing there, so they were not really significant weight-wise. So with the two bullet bases and the fragments that kind of go together, we're looking at two bullets that are approximately 60% of the original weight of that bullet when it was fired.
Now, based on your examinations of the bullet fragments, were you able to determine with certainty what weapon fired the cartridges?
Kind of, yes.
What do you mean by kind of?
So what I do is, when I look at all of these bullet fragments, I look at the weight, I look at the composition, I also look at the rifling information that's present on the bullets. The two bullet bases that had rifling information on them possessed 6 land and groove impressions with a right-hand twist. That rifling information that's on the outside of the bullet comes from the outside of the bullet making contact with the rifling on the inside of the barrel. So I can look at the number of land and groove impressions that are present, the direction, which in this case is a right-hand twist, which basically means that bullet, when it goes down the barrel, is spinning in a clockwise fashion as it moves down the barrel. And then I can also look at the dimensions of that rifling information that's present. So I can look at the diameter of each of the grooves that's present, and there are 6 little grooves all the way around the circumference of those bullets. So when I weigh them, look at the numbers, the direction, and the dimensions, that information can be put into an FBI database, and that FBI database will tell me all of the makes and models of firearms that have barrels with those dimensions and could be possible suspect firearms in the case that we're looking for. So that information was also provided to the submitting agency.
Based on the rifling information you observed, could the bullets have been fired by a Remington 770?
Yeah, so Remington was one of the manufacturers that I listed in my report, and that particular model could be a suspect firearm, yes.
Did you attempt to determine if the bullet fragments you were provided had been fired by the same weapon?
Yeah, later on in the investigation, there were a couple of other bullets that were submitted that came from another source, and I was asked to look at those bullets, compare them to the 2 bullet bases that had rifling information on them, try to determine whether they came from the same firearm.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness? What's been marked as Exhibit 121, 124, and 125. Can you take a look at those items?
Yes.
What is exhibit, or what is item identified as 121?
So 121 is a photograph that was taken by me underneath a microscope to show some of those class characteristics that we were talking about earlier. The diameter of the bullet, the diameter of the rifling information that's present on those 2 bullets, just to show that they have the same class of rifling, which allowed me to come to that conclusion that they could have come from the same firearm.
And on 124?
So 124 is a comparison of a bullet that was submitted later, and it was compared to one of the bullets from the original scene.
And 125?
And then 125, again, there were 2 bullets that were submitted from a different source, from a different place. And so 125 is the second bullet that was submitted from that other location, and trying to show how it compares to the bullet from the scene as well.
Are those true and accurate representations of what you observed under the microscope?
Yes, they are.
State would offer 124, 125, and 121.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Exhibits 121, 124, and 125 are admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I publish to the jury?
You may.
Yeah, those 2.
Just the 3.
Thank you. This is Exhibit 121. Your Honor, may the witness step down to
He may.
identify marks.
He may.
Or do you have a pointer? Would that help? No? Okay, pick it up.
So can you explain to the jury on the photograph what are the identifying marks that you're comparing?
So again, this is a photograph that was taken of the 2 bullets from the scene, one from the fridge and one from the floor. They're side by side. You can see kind of a line of separation that runs vertically through the middle of that photograph.
You can go right over to the picture if you want.
I think I'm okay for
Okay.
now, but I might in a second.
Okay.
So this photograph was taken using a comparison microscope that I have in my laboratory, which is a little different than some in that it has 2 stages. So on one stage I put one of the bullets from the fridge, on the other stage the bullet from the floor in this case. So I can arrange those bullets so that I can look at the 2 of them. When I look through the eyepieces, I can see both of those items at the same time, just like you're seeing in the photograph. So in this photograph, it's a little hard.
Your Honor, if I may, I think it would be helpful if Mr. Murillo was a little closer so he could actually point to the...
I agree. Thank you. So it's a little hard to see the overall width of the bullet. It might be, if you look at it kind of closer, you can see one side of the bullet here and one side of the bullet kind of up on top. And so that gives you the diameter, the width of that overall bullet. We talked earlier about rifling information that's present on those bullets. And that comes from, again, the bullet making contact with the inside of the barrel. There are going to be lands or grooves that are manufactured in a spiraling fashion on the inside of the barrel of that gun. What's left over after the grooves are made are what we call lands, the part that's untouched, where there are no grooves in that barrel. So the part that's untouched is sticking out of the barrel, and as the bullet passes through the barrel, that part that's sticking out of the barrel is going to cut a groove in the bullet. It's from a land, so we call it a land impression, but really for you it kind of looks like a groove that's been pushed into the side of that bullet. So when I talked about the number of land and groove impressions that are around the circumference of that bullet, that's what I'm referring to. This would be one of the land impressions, this would be another one, and there's going to be 4 more all the way around the circumference of that bullet. So not only am I looking at the number and the direction, and in this case, if you look at the base as kind of a reference point, you can see the rifling is kind of tilted to the right. It might be a little hard to see, but I can see it under the microscope a little easier that the rifling information is tilted a little bit to the right, which tells me it's a right-hand twist, that it's going to spin clockwise, as opposed to tilting left, which means it's going to spin in a counterclockwise fashion as it moves down the barrel.
Your Honor, may I ask that we do it in a little more question-answer format, just so I can follow?
I think that's appropriate. Mr. Robinson, why don't you ask another question?
Thank you, Your Honor. If I could, we'll just move on to Exhibit 124. And again, just very basically remind the jury of what we're looking at in this photograph.
So this photograph is 2 bullets again. 94 is one of those bullets from that other scene, and 5 on the right-hand side is one of the bullets from our original shooting scene.
And does this photo show the comparison of the lands and grooves?
Yes, again, we're looking at the diameter of the bullet, the width of the rifling markings, and it's showing that they are similar between the two. The direction is the same, and so that's what we're trying to show in the photograph.
In Exhibit 125, again, is this a photo that's depicting the lands and grooves that you're comparing?
Yeah, you can see the same rifling information on both bullets. Again, the widths of the land and groove impressions is the same. And again, this is the second bullet from that other scene versus one of the bullets from our original shooting scene on the right.
Thank you. If you want to return to your seats. Now, I kind of want to back up for just a second. You've been referring to 2 bullets provided from another scene. Are you aware of where those bullets came from?
I think the only general information I was given is that it was an area where a rifle was discharged previously, like several years before, and some bullets were dug out of a targeted area, and that's what we were looking at with the 2 higher numbered items, I think of 94 and 97. So those came from a different area where a suspect firearm was supposedly discharged. I don't know the exact location, so it was just a different area where that firearm was fired.
Now, can you say, from your comparison of those bullet fragments that we were just looking at, that they were fired by the same weapon?
No, I can't say definitely that they were fired from the same firearm.
Are they consistent with having been fired by the same firearm?
In this particular case, what we say is it's possible. When I did my microscopic comparison, the result was inconclusive. So it could have been fired from the same firearm, those bullets. It's possible they may not have been fired from the same firearm.
Now, did you receive firearms for comparison testing in this case?
Yes.
When you attempted your comparisons, in this case, what specifically were you looking for?
So there were, I believe, 3 other rifles that were submitted in this case. I looked at all 3 of them, take a lot of information off of them. They're test-fired, and then I compare the test-fired bullets from those rifles to the unknowns, the 2 bullets from our original scene, from the floor and from the refrigerator. I'm trying to determine whether those bullets could have come from those suspect firearms that were submitted.
Now, when you're comparing the unknowns to the bullets you test fired, are you looking for any distinctive markings to make a comparison?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm doing is looking for those class characteristics. So do they have the same number of grooves in their fired bullets? Are the dimensions the same? If they are, then I can start looking for unique individual characteristics and try and determine whether those are present.
Now, in this case, on the unknown bullets, were there unique characteristics you were looking for on the test-fired bullets?
So there were 3, we're talking about the 3 rifles, I assume, right?
Well, let me back up for just a second. Were there any unique characteristics on the bullet fragments you received from the crime scene or from the autopsy?
So the 2 bullets from the fridge and from the floor possessed the same caliber, same dimension, same rifling, same numbers, same dimensions. We've already showed that in the photograph. So it's certainly possible they could have come from the same firearm. I didn't do a microscopic examination to try and determine whether they both came from the same firearm. I was hoping that we, at some point, would get a suspect firearm soon so that I could do a comparison of that suspect firearm.
And now, turning to the firearms you were provided, did you receive a Remington 7600 270 Winchester pump-action rifle?
Yes.
And were you able to conduct a comparison of that rifle with the bullets from the crime scene?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion?
So the result of that comparison between that Remington rifle and the unknowns was inconclusive. Again, I couldn't determine whether it came from that firearm or not.
And why could you not exclude that firearm?
So in this case, just like the photographs that we looked at earlier, all the class characteristics were the same. So they had the same diameter, same number of lands and grooves, the direction of twist is the same, the dimensions were the same, but I was missing individual, unique stria, tiny little scratches, kind of like a fingerprint that's left on the bullets that I can use for comparison and say definitely these have the same unique pattern of markings and were fired from the same firearm. That unique information was not sufficient to make a determination whether it was or was not fired in that particular firearm.
And did you also receive a Ruger M77 Remington bolt-action rifle?
Yes.
And were you able to conduct a comparison with that rifle?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion on that?
So the bullets in this particular case from the scene were not fired from that Ruger rifle.
So you were able to exclude that as having fired the bullets?
That is correct.
And did you also receive a Savage Axis 270 Winchester bolt-action rifle?
Yes.
And were you able to conduct a comparison with that rifle?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion?
It was the same. The bullets in this case from the scene, I believe, were not fired from that Savage rifle as well.
Now, you testified earlier that the bullets from the crime scene could have been fired by Remington 770 based on their general rifling characteristics. Is that accurate?
Correct.
And are there other firearms that share that same general rifling characteristics?
Yes, and in my report, I think I listed a few manufacturers that have those same rifling dimensions in their barrels. So not just Remington, but I think there were some other manufacturers that could be suspect firearms in this case.
Your Honor, may I retrieve an exhibit?
You may.
Exhibit 32 for the record. Can you take a look at this and tell the jury the model of rifle listed there?
This, first of all, appears to be a receipt form from Sportsman's Warehouse. Looks like the information on the receipt is Remington 770, 270 Winchester, or Win, W-I-N. And then there's a serial number as well.
Now, if you were to be provided a large number of Remington 770, 270 Winchesters, and you attempted to compare them with the unknown bullets from the crime scene, is it possible that they would all be inconclusive?
Yeah, that's certainly one possibility. They're all going to have the same class rifling information, and so it's always going to be a possibility they could have been fired from that gun. So then I'd have to look at the individual characteristics, those unique markings. But it's still, one of the conclusions may be that it's inconclusive. I wouldn't be able to make a determination.
And would it also be possible that you could be provided the murder weapon and that your comparison would be inconclusive?
Yes, it would.
And how could that be possible?
So again, if I was provided what we all agree is the firearm, and if I were to test fire that gun, I would again have to look at the microscopic markings on the test fired bullets versus what I'm seeing on the unknowns. It still may be possible that there's not enough individual characteristics present, either on the unknowns or on the test fires. If there's not enough of those unique markings, that fingerprint information present on one or the other, then the results would be inconclusive, even if we know that's the gun. If I had video evidence of that gun being fired and dropped, and then it was picked up by law enforcement and they sent it to me, I'm not going to use that video evidence. I'm not going to use any investigative information. I have to look at just the fired bullets. And if that information is not present, then I have to say it's inconclusive.
Shifting gears a little bit, did you conduct any examination of Shirley Carter's clothing in this case?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that question. So.
Sorry about that. Did you conduct an examination of Shirley Carter's clothing in this case?
The clothing, yes, I did.
And what was the purpose of that examination?
So there were 2 items of clothing that were submitted. My job was to look for holes that were in the clothing and ultimately look for any residues that might be present around those holes, possibly try to get an idea of the muzzle to target distance that those shots were fired into the victim's clothing.
Were you able to make any conclusions about that?
There weren't enough residues to actually do a muzzle to target distance determination. However, I found several holes and was able to determine entrance and exit holes, but I could not make a determination as to how far the gun was to the victim.
And you mentioned residues. Does the crime lab do gunshot residue testing?
We do, and that's part of what we're talking about. So when that gun is fired, there's a bullet that comes out of the barrel, and there's a lot of powder. You saw all the powder in that vial. Some of it's going to be burned, some unburned, carbon residue. It's all going to be deposited on a target if that target is close enough to the weapon and when it's discharged. And it'll leave a specific diameter pattern depending on how close the gun is. So that was my job, is to look for those residues, see if there's a pattern that I can measure, and hopefully do some type of test with the gun if we were to get one, and figure out what that muzzle to target distance was. In this particular case, I couldn't find any specific pattern of residues.
Does the lab do gunshot residue testing on a suspect's hands?
We do not, no.
And why don't you do that type of testing?
We actually used to do that type of testing a long time ago. We don't do it anymore. The instrument that we used for that particular examination, it was no longer functioning correctly. We didn't want to buy a new one. And a lot of the results that we were getting from some of those tests didn't really help. They weren't probative. They weren't helping in the investigation in a lot of those cases. So we just thought it was really not justifiable to spend the money and do the work on that type of testing when it didn't really help in a lot of the cases that we were looking at.
Why wasn't it working?
Well, again, a lot of it has to do with the interpretation of those results that you find on the hands. For instance, if we were to have swabbed Shirley Carter's hands in this case, we may have found residue on her hands. A lot of times that residue, when it's found on the hands, is interpreted as, well, she must have fired a gun. In this particular case, it doesn't mean she fired a gun. It means the gun was possibly fired in her direction and the residue was deposited on her hands in some way. And that could be the same for any victim. Same for a suspect. If we were to swab a suspect's hands, if you find residue, it could mean that he handled a gun or discharged a gun. It could be contamination from something else. If we don't find residue, it doesn't mean that he didn't fire a gun. You could fire a gun, fire several shots, and not have residues deposited on your hands. So that doesn't really help. So even if you discharge a firearm, you may not have residues. If you didn't discharge a firearm, you're not going to have residues. So the fact that you don't have anything doesn't really mean that you didn't discharge a firearm or that you did discharge a firearm. So the results are kind of left up to interpretation by the investigators and really don't help you in your case a lot.
And how long has it been since you've done that type of testing at the lab?
It was probably the late 90s when we stopped doing that type of testing.
And I want to return to something you talked about early on when we were talking about ejecting the casing or the cartridge case. Are there different ways that cartridge cases are manually ejected?
Well, it depends on the firearm. In this particular case, that .270 Winchester rifle is often used in a bolt-action rifle. So when you discharge the rifle, you physically have to move the bolt up and to the rear, and that would eject or manually eject the cartridge case out of the gun before you load the next cartridge by pushing the bolt forward, locking it in place. So that would be one type of action that could be used to manually eject. It could be a pump-type rifle. So once you fire it, the fore-end, the part that you would grab a hold of with your offhand, you could pull it to the rear, like a shotgun is sometimes fired in a lot of movies. Pull it to the rear, and that's what ejects the cartridge case. Push the fore-end back to that forward position, and that loads the next cartridge that's going to be fired. So it depends on the action of that particular firearm, but the shooter has to perform some type of action in that particular case to eject, manually eject those cartridge cases.
I have no more questions at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Ross, do you expect a lengthy cross-examination?
No, Your Honor.
Very well, let's proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Murillo.
Morning.
When you were just referring to ejecting a cartridge from a breech and reload, let me start over. Let's get a couple of terms clear. When we say round, that's often a slang term for a cartridge.
Yes.
And when we say rack, that's often a slang term for ejecting the spent cartridge and putting a live cartridge back into a breech.
Yes.
Explain to the jury, you've already done it with regard to a bolt action, but explain to the jury the mechanism involved in racking around with regard to, let's say, a lever action rifle.
So a lever action rifle could be another suspect firearm that could have been used in this case. So a lever action is going to be kind of like the old Western type cowboy rifles that were used a long time ago. They're still available and manufactured today, but they're going to have a long looping lever that's on the bottom of the grip that's kind of attached to the action of the rifle. So once the gun is fired, the lever that is on the back side of the trigger is pushed down and forward, and that is what extracts and ejects the cartridge case, and then the lever is pulled back up and kind of squeezed into the grip, and that's what loads the next cartridge that's going to be fired in that rifle.
How would you rack another round if you were talking about a semi-automatic pistol?
So yeah, if you're talking about a pistol, we're talking about a handgun now. If we were to manually cycle a semi-automatic pistol,
Can we use rack around just so we stay consistent with these different models? For the
So-
jury's sake?
well, in a semi-automatic pistol, the cartridge case is going to be automatically extracted and ejected. It's not manually ejected. If there was a live round in the chamber, we didn't want to shoot that particular round, we could pull the slide to the rear on a semi-auto pistol, and that would extract and eject the live round from that chamber. So on a semi-automatic pistol, it's a little different than the rifles and the other actions we were just talking about, but it could be manually ejected as well.
And you've talked a little bit about shotguns and how you would rack around with a slide action or pump action shotgun, right?
Yes.
Now, when people think of shotguns, they think of a shot pattern that's spread out with a bunch of little bullets, typically. Right?
Correct.
But shotguns can also fire slugs, which create one hole, right?
Correct.
So you've got, and I know that a pistol is not alleged to be the weapon which was used in this case, but pistols which fire bullets, shotguns shooting slugs, any number of rifles all fire one projectile which can leave one hole, right?
Correct.
And you talked a little bit earlier about how velocity, weight, diameter all can make a difference in the amount of energy that is impacted when that bullet strikes an object.
Correct.
The amount of energy that's delivered and the corresponding amount of damage it causes to the item the bullet strikes also can depend on how much resistance is present in the object, right?
Sure. Yes.
So if you shoot a piece of paper with a very light, low-powered projectile and you shoot a piece of paper with a very heavy, high-velocity projectile, as long as they have the same diameter, because the paper doesn't put up much resistance, the holes you would see left would look about the same.
Theoretically, yes, they should.
Whereas if you shot a quarter-inch thick piece of steel with something like a 22 round, it may leave a small indentation, but if you shoot it with a high-powered rifle, it may leave a hole that's significantly larger.
It could, yes.
When you said, well, let me just be clear. So if I told you, and you were out of the lab and we didn't have any equipment, and I just said, Mr. Murillo, there's a hole the size of my finger, that doesn't really give you any information, does it? Other than that it's something that's capable of leaving a hole the size of my finger.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hole. We have to do some testing on that hole to try and figure out what made it. There's some chemical tests, physical tests, other things that we can do, but just by looking at the hole only, no, we can't determine what made that hole.
Right. So given the myriad types of firearms available, the huge number of cartridges that are available, the amount of resistance that may be present, if I told you it left a finger-sized hole, that's not going to tell you that I'm referring to anything specific.
That is correct.
Okay. When you talked about the state deciding they didn't want to do testing anymore of people's hands, because I think you said it's, did you say confusing, or am I thinking of a different case?
It is confusing, yes.
It is especially confusing if it's not consistent, if the results aren't consistent with the state's theory of what happened. Are you following me where I'm going?
The results that we get of that test could be consistent with a number of things.
Well, in this case, for example, you know that Shirley Carter was deceased and she's the victim of being shot.
Correct.
If the state had tested her hand for gunshot residue, and let's say one hand was positive and one hand wasn't, that could be very confusing because it doesn't fit any theory of what's going on there, right?
I think we could probably come up with some theory.
Well, let's say your theory was that Joe Smith walked into the Casey's and he shot somebody. And you took Joe Smith later and you did a test on his hand and it was positive for gunpowder residue. That would not be confusing, would it?
Again, it depends on how you're interpreting that residue and what's present there.
It depends on how the state wants that test result interpreted. Fair enough?
Objection, argumentative.
I'll withdraw the question, Your Honor.
Move to strike, Your Honor.
As I previously indicated to you, ladies and gentlemen, questions asked by attorneys are not evidence to be considered by you.
I apologize for that, and I'll try to stay away from those kinds of questions, Mr. Murillo. I want to understand, though, your testimony here today. You've said that, that the gun, that one of the three guns you tested, maybe all of them, how many of them could not be excluded as the gun that fired the bullets that killed Shirley Carter?
So there was one Remington rifle that I looked at that could not be excluded.
Two could, one could not be.
Correct.
But just so we can put that into context, is it fair to say that there are a number of makes and models of rifles that, given what we know about the fragments that were left at the scene, there are a large number of make and model of firearms that cannot be excluded?
That is correct.
In fact, Ms. Branstad took your deposition a few months ago, I think.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yes.
And you had told her at that time that there were several makes and models of firearms in some database that could not be excluded.
Yes.
that you said they're listed in your report.
Yes,
And you said that more are added all the time to that report.
they are.
And your report was from 2015.
Yes,
Has anyone checked to see if more firearms have been added since 2015?
we have not.
I think you listed a Browning Model 81, a Kimber Model 84M, Remington Models 721, 725, 760, 700, 742, and 770. Does that sound right?
Yes,
And you said that there could be more.
yes.
I don't think I have any other questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect, Mr. Robinson?
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thanks, sir. You may step down. May this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, can I defer my decision on that until after the break?
Yes.
Thank you.
We'll let you know before noon whether you can be excused.
Am I to stay here in Council Bluffs, or?
Well,
For
I'm
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our morning recess. We're going to be at recess until about 5 after 11. Please remember the admonition I've given you. Keep an open mind. Do not discuss the case with anyone. Thank you.